In this video, we want to look at another control, which is the list box. In the previous video, we used a text box where we'd set the multi-line to true. And a list box is sort of like that, except a list box has multiple lines, but each line is indexed as its own entity. So it creates a collection of lists, and we can reference those lists not only by the text of the item, but also by the index of the item. Now it's important to remember that, as we stated before, in most cases when you're counting in C#, we start counting with 0. So the first item is going to be item 0. So I have a program here running called listbox demo, and this is my list box here. I have some produce that I put into that list box, and there's an items property that we can add to the collection of that property and enter items that we want to have in the list box. So in this case, I entered 5 produce items, and they are then referenced as 0 through 5. So apples would be my item sub 0, bananas item sub 1, and watermelons are item sub 4 since it's the 5th element. Now we have a bunch of methods that we can use with a list box. And by the way, LST is the Hungarian notation for a list box. So my list box here I named LST produce, using that camel casing with the uppercase P. So one of the things we can do is look at the items and get the count of the items, and that is a property that returns the number of items, and we'll do that with this button here. How many items are there? So I press this button and I get a message box saying there are 5 items in the list, and I coded that using the items.count. There is a clear button which will clear all the items in the list. I did not put that into this example. I can also get any item by saying items sub n.toString, and n in this case is the index number of the item that I want to convert to a string. I can add items to the list or to the items collection by specifying .items.add and specifying a new string. And that's what I did here with the add new item. I've got a text box named txt new item, and I've entered strawberries in there, and if I click add new item, it adds strawberries to the list. Now if I were to click it again, I put a little if statement in my code that basically checks to see if it's already in the list, and if it is, it says duplicate strawberries is already in the list. Not the best of grammar, but it works. We can insert an item at a particular location. So right now I have this list with the sorted property set to true, which means it's going to automatically alphabetize my list. If that was set to false, I could choose to insert an item at a specific location. Just like the add statement, I'd provide the new string of what I want to add in, and then a comma, and then the index number. So if I wanted it to be the very first item, it would be the item I want to add, comma, 0. If I wanted it to be the very last item, it could be the item, comma, and then I could get here lstproduce.items.count, and that would put the item in the last item in my list, regardless of how long that list was. There is a remove method as part of the items collection, and there I just simply tell it what I want to remove. What's the text? It's got to match. It's usually easier to use remove at and to say items.remove at and give it the index number. We can retrieve an item that the user has selected. So if I'm going to get rid of strawberries now that I've added it, I could say remove selected item. I used a message box to make sure that the user actually wants to remove that item, so we can use a dialog result. And if they click no, nothing happens, but if they click yes, it removed the item. Same thing, I can get the selected item that they have selected. So that would be the text, the index is the index number, and I actually use both of those in that little button. To show the selected item, nothing right now is selected, and again I use an if statement here. So if the selected item is -1, meaning a -1 is no index was selected, it should be selected index equals -1. I bring up a message box saying you must first select an item in the list. Let's say we select cantaloupe, and I then say show selected item, and now I'm told you selected cantaloupe, which is at index 2. So here I'm using the selected item and the selected index in terms of creating my prompt string of the message box. So that's a brief rundown of list boxes and the different features and methods of a list box, and as well as of properties. Since count is a property and selected index and selected item are also properties, let's take a look at how I did this in Visual Studio. In Visual Studio, I've already created my project as 03O Listbox Demo, and that's the title I put on my form. And I set the form to 400, 340. I gave it a background color of yellow-green, that's in the web panel. And then I've created all my other controls except for the list box. You've already know how to create all these controls, so you don't need to watch me do it. But basically I have a label here that says produce available. Our list box is going to go underneath that. Another label that just says new item. It's not named. Here's my txt new item text box. I put a default value of strawberries in there. Then I have a button named btn add item, btn show selected, and you can see the captions or the text that I've entered in these buttons, btn how many, and btn remove. So the final step here is I want to add my list box. Now normally I'd probably start with adding my list box because that's sort of the centerpiece, and then do everything around that. I'm coming to the toolbox and grab a list box. I'm just going to drag it over and position it where I want it and resize it. And then so things show up a little better, I'm going to set the font property. And I think I'll use about 11 point, maybe 12. And I can see how things are going to look in that box. Now I want to add some items to the box to start with. I'm going to scroll down to the items property, and for the collection I'm going to click on the property and open up the dialog box for the collection. And I can begin entering strings. So I want bananas, I want apples, watermelon, lemons, and cantaloupe. I'm going to click OK. And I see those items in my list. Now there's another property which is the sorted property. And if I choose sorted, and by default it is false, but if I make that true, then the items will be alphabetically sorted. If they're numeric, they'd be in numeric order. I want to name my list box LST produce. And that is the extent of creating my list box. And now we'll look at the code. I'm going to create my properties back over. And let's look at the code for add new item. So btn add item underscore click. So the first thing we're starting with is an if statement. We're checking to make sure if the list box already contains the text that's in that text box. If it does, we're simply going to show a message box that says it's already in the list and that the title will be duplicate. If it's not, our else fork here, we're simply going to add the item to the list by using items.add, and then inside the parentheses what we want to add. In this case, it's the string value of the text of txt new item. For the show selected, again, using an if structure, we're going to check to make sure they actually selected something. If they didn't select anything, the selected index of the list box is a -1. Obviously, we don't use 0 because 0 would be the first item. So if it is a -1, we're going to show a message box that says you must first select an item in the list, and the title is nothing selected. If it's not a -1, meaning they've selected an item, then we can say else messagebox.show you selected, and we're going to concatenate the item they selected using selected.item. That's the text of the item.
which is at index and concatenating the selected index.toString. That's the index number from 0 to however many items there are. And the title is selected item. We'll run each of these in a minute. For how many, the button that says how many items are there. For the how many items, create an integer variable named num items equals my listbox.items.count, and that begins counting with 1. And they simply display that in a message box. There are concatenating num items.toString and concatenating items in the list, and the title is number of items. For the remove selected item, just as we did in the show selected, we want to make sure they actually selected something. So if they didn't, we give a message box. You must first select an item to remove in the list. Nothing selected is the title. Else, and I'm going to confirm that they actually want to remove that item. In case they accidentally clicked that button, I always want to confirm that they really want to do that action. So we create a dialog result object called dr, and passing into that the result of messagebox.show. Are you sure you want to remove the selected item and a question mark, and then the title is confirmed deletion. And here we're using message box buttons yes, no, and cancel. So no and cancel won't do anything, but the yes, if they responded dialog result.yes, so dr is equal to that, then we're going to remove that item at that index. Now optionally, I could have also used the remove item and passed it the string. Either way will work. If that item actually occurred more than once, it would remove the first one in this case. So I kind of like using the index, so we're guaranteed of getting the item they actually selected. And that's our code. Let me just run this one more time so you can see this work. So we're going to add strawberries. Now if I click it again, I'm told that strawberries is already in the list. But I can clear that out and add something else, such as mangoes. Add that item. I can show selected item. If nothing is selected, I'm told you must first select an item in the list. I realize I misspelled cantaloupe there. Show selected item. You selected lemons, which is at index 3. Remember, we start counting with 0, so 0, 1, 2, 3. Now, in your response to the user, you might want to add 1 to that index number and say which is at line 4 or item 4, because users typically don't start counting at 0. But I wanted to show you the index number. If I choose something else like strawberries, that's at index 5. How many items? Well, there are now 7 items in the list, and again that starts counting with 1. And then I want to remove an item. So I'm going to get rid of the mangoes. Are you sure you want to remove? I say no, nothing happens. If I say cancel, nothing happens. But if I say yes, it removes it. If nothing is selected and I say remove selected item, I'm told I must first select an item to remove. So that is how we create list boxes and code for the different methods of a list box. We will use list boxes quite a bit moving forward in this course.